What if I told you that the key to winning more at the last spell is actually winning less at each night of the last spell? It's a little hard for me to wrap my mind around, and I expect that you're a little skeptical. But lately, I've realized that the advice that I give to new players might actually be doing more harm than good. So today we're going to set the record straight by doing a deep dive on the mechanics of corpse spawning in the last spell and how to take advantage of it to its fullest. So let's jump right into that. If you've hung around this channel at all, you'll know that I'm not a big fan of hyperbolic thumbnails and titles, and I will assure you that this video has neither. But to explain how my thinking about the last spell changed so drastically, I'm going to need to tell a little bit of a story about where we are in playing the game. I've put in about 600-ish hours in the last spell, and I've beaten it every which way to Sunday. We've beaten it on Apocalypse 6, and we've started to do random challenge runs. Not too long ago, we beat Lakeburg with only heroes that punch. We've also tried a couple of runs where heroes haven't attacked at all, or we've only used spiky counter and poisonous. But the short version is that we were searching for more and more challenging ways to play the game. And one of my viewers, hot on the heels of my The Floor is Lava run, where I beat Glenwall without any of my heroes stepping outside of the Haven, said, what if you flip that on its ear and do a run where you can only kill enemies that are inside of your Haven? AKA they have that little purple exclamation point over their head and you can't hurt anyone else. And at first I was like, okay, this sounds like an interesting challenge. And we picked it up and we did it. And I came to the end of it and I was like, wait a second. That was easier than most of the runs that I had been doing. That challenge run was missing the challenge. If you listen to Ishtar's rhetoric on the last spell, corpse piles are meant to be a high risk, high reward strategy, right? You let the enemies come to you, and because they are gnawing on your walls and inside of your haven causing panic, it is more dangerous, and as a result, they give you more corpse piles, which are good. That particular run that I was just talking about, though, actually showed me that this particular strategy is slightly more risk for a ton more reward. And this realization really changed the way that I fundamentally think about playing the last spell, especially in the early game. From my perspective, corpse strategies are not only insanely strong and something that every player should be using in nearly every run, but they feel like a very core part of nearly any early game. They can get you to those early upgrades faster. They give you more gold and materials to build the infrastructure out that you need to. They give you gear without having to invest heavily in production buildings. The short of it is they are incredibly good, and if you are not creating corpse piles, you're leaving a lot of resources and capacity to grow your heroes on the table. So starting now, I'm going to explain how to take advantage of this mechanic to its fullest. How do you eke out the most benefit from corpse piles? And I'm going to do that in two parts. Don't worry, I'm not going to bury the lead. Part one is going to be the answer to that question. What does the strategy look like? And in broad strokes, how does this system work? I'm hoping that'll take maybe 10 minutes. And during that time, I'm going to go over everything you need to put this strategy into practice. Then in the second part of the video, I'm going to do the stuff that for me, I like to geek out about, which is the deep dive into what I found when I dug into the code, the spreadsheet that I created to help myself understand these mechanics, and then some graphics and things like that that fully explain all of the equation and all of the mechanics behind it. Every single number and detail that you need to fully understand it. Part two is not really important if you're just trying to play the game better, but it's kind of interesting and I wanted to include it. I also want to make a big shout out to Wensha on Reddit, who was the first person to initially do this research. Their Reddit post, which is linked below, was amazing, but its numbers are now out of date, and I wanted to kind of update it for the current version of the game, which doesn't look like it's going to be changing anytime soon. So without further ado, let's start talking about that level 1, the basic mechanics and strategy. Simply put, corpses spawn where enemies have died, and there are 3 things that influence whether a corpse will spawn or not. The location of the tile, specifically how close is it to the last spell, how powerful were the enemies that died there, and how numerous were the enemies that died there. Those 3 things combined determine what tiles corpses will spawn on and whether or not a corpse can spawn on a given tile. Each map also has a limit on the number of corpses that can spawn for each of its nights. We'll cover that in level 2 if you're interested, but the short version is almost all the maps you can get a lot of corpse piles pretty early on, so it's worth just starting out and going ham right off the bat. So what's the strategy? I don't know how to put this, but it's fight enemies in your haven. That's pretty much it. There's some more specifics and some more nuance to it, but the short version is if you wait for the enemies to come to you and then you knock them down, you're going to get a lot of corpse piles if you are fighting them once they start to generate panic, aka they have that purple exclamation point over their head. So as a simple, straightforward graphic, you used to fight them outside of your base. Now you want to fight them inside of your base. So how do you go about doing this in a way where you don't get destroyed? The first thing you want to do is tear down all of your walls and ruins. Believe it or not, even on the first night, you are going to be able to spend your workers on corpse piles, and you're going to get way more out of them than even a 4-sized ruin. So it's probably not worth saving any of your ruins. If you want to save one 4-size ruin, you can, but it's really not necessary. Secondly, you're not going to build a seer ever. This is a real big departure from the way that I used to tell people to play. The seer is really great because it pushes back the fog, which gives you a lot of time to kill the enemies. But the reality is it really minimizes the number of corpse piles you're going to get because you're killing a lot of enemies far away from the circle, which is bad for business. The next piece of the strategy is you build ballistas directly adjacent to your spell. This has a couple of benefits, the main one being that a ring of ballistas directly around your spell, their maximum range is right around the edge of your haven. So your ballistas are going to be killing all the things that get inside your haven without killing all of the things that are outside of your haven. Also, another benefit here is that your ballistas, being a ring around your last spell, act as a wall. So enemies can't run all the way up to your last spell because the ballistas physically block them. Next up is you keep your base tight. You're not going to be building a lot of production buildings. In fact, you're going to be building no production buildings except maybe a couple gold mines or a couple scavenger camps if you want to, but you're going to keep it all incredibly close to the last spell. You're trying to make a very small base in the center of your larger base so that you have a lot of haven tiles around you that are open where your heroes can do their work and kill the things that they need to kill. In terms of the actual execution of knights, early on, you want to be softening up enemies as they're coming in. So things like hand crossbows where you can plink a few and get them down to half is great. But you don't want to be killing anything, just taking them rather low so that when they step in and get the exclamation point, you can knock them down. Then all you have to do is wait for the enemies to enter your haven. And when they cross the doorstep, let them have it. And then the rest is just reaping the benefits on the far side. A few caveats that are worth mentioning when it comes to this strategy is that it's going to take a little trial and error. I think new players are not going to try this their first time and just hit a home run. So what I would recommend is make it a goal to try to get enemies close as you can to the haven and slowly learn your tolerances, because once you know your tolerances, then you'll be able to push it further and further. At this point, I think I understand things well enough that I'm never worried about anybody coming in and hitting my bases unless I have some particularly bad RNG. When you make misjudgments about the strength of a wave or the speed at which a wave is coming in, you will get punished for it. This strategy is somewhat unforgiving. There's a little bit of high risk here, but not a lot. You also need to think about it from the perspective that you are standing around at the beginning. Some people will probably say that perseverance could be a good talent to pick up, and I don't disagree, although I think it's relatively minimal in its overall value delivered. But at the end of the day, the first couple of turns, you're standing around twiddling your thumbs, losing DPS, which means your average DPS for the rest of the round needs to be higher to make up for it. That means you need to have good builds, you need to have good gear, and you need to kind of know how to play the game a little bit. But generally on normal difficulty through APOC like 2, it's not a huge deal. And then last but not least, the ballistas are optional, but they help out a great deal here because their fire is so concentrated that if you have a ring of ballistas, right, you have say 25-ish ballistas ringing your last spell, they're putting out a lot of concentrated damage because they're all grouped together as opposed to being spread to the edges of your haven. So this strategy lends itself very well to ballista strats. So why are we doing this, right? Why is this strategy so good? What is the value proposition? And the short answer is that once you get up to 12 workers, those 12 workers are going to be doing insane work for you, right? Here, this table shows you clearly the values that you can expect to get from things. And for most knights, you can expect to be getting 4 to 5 mountains, an elite carry-on or 2 if they are available, and then piles with the rest. What that means is you're getting up to 17 items, 2 of which that are epic level, or 404 gold and 716 materials that can be increased by 20% with omens, and you can pick up another scavenge on top of that. That is a huge amount of resources that you are getting with zero investment. You haven't built any production buildings, you haven't upgraded any production buildings. You've literally just killed the things that you are required to kill, built some houses, and upgraded those houses. That's it. So this strategy is incredibly potent in that regard. So, believe it or not, that's it. Congratulations. You now know how to take advantage of corpse files to your benefit. I don't know how long that took us, but I'm hoping that it was relatively quick. And for those of you who want to shuffle off and stop watching, go play some last spell and enjoy yourself. But for the rest, it's time to talk about level 2. And level 2 is where things, from my perspective, get interesting, right? How do these systems actually work? Why do they work? How should we think about them? And so the first thing is I decided to create a flowchart that explains what the game is doing behind the scenes. The red region that you see here is the factors that we discussed before. The number of enemies, the location of the tile in question, the type of enemy that died, and then the map has a little caveat associated with it. So the game is tracking all 3 of these things really for each tile on the map. Every time an enemy dies, it's adding a little check mark to that particular tile and counting all of that up. We'll go through this kind of as we go, but the basic flow of it is it takes all of this stuff, mashes some of it together, tosses it into a formula, generates some percentage chances, and then checks those percentage chances to decide if any corpses get spawned. So first and foremost, let's talk about the location of the tile. So this that you are looking at is not a piece of abstract art, but this is in fact Elderlicht. And if you don't believe me, hopefully there'll be a sweet snazzy graphic going on right now that demonstrates how this is indeed Elderlicht. I worked far too hard on that. Give me a break. But anyways, the short version is that all of the maps are split into 6 regions. And these 6 regions are in the code titled C3H and then O1, O2, O4, and O8. And what they stand for is C3 is the center tiles that are 3 away from the last spell. Then H is your haven tiles. Then O1 are the tiles that are directly adjacent to the walls of your haven. Then O2 are the tiles 2 to 3 away from your haven. 04 are the tiles 4 to 7 tiles away, and then 08 are the absolute boonies 8+ tiles away from your haven. And unsurprisingly, the tiles C3 have more value associated with them, right? When something dies there, a larger number is added to that tile than 08, where when something dies, there's a very nominal amount added to that tile's chance to spawn a corpse. So that's your location stuff, basically, in a nutshell. That's the way to think about locations. Every map is split up that same way, and you can create that same overlay if you want to. So now we need to talk about types of enemies and the enemy tiers. So this is pretty straightforward, but the last spell has 4 enemy tiers, and they are not created equal, much like we previously discussed with the tiles having a certain innate value associated with them. Each tier does as well. So your most common enemies, your claws, your runners, your dodgers, are part of tier 1 and have the least value, while your tier 4 enemies, which is only bulkies and twisted, have an incredible amount of value associated with them. And that value translates directly to chance to spawn corpses. So now that we have the enemy types and the locations figured out, we need to do a value lookup. So we need to take a particular tier of enemy, couple it with a particular location, and figure out how much that is worth in terms of percentage points. So I decided to do a bit of a graph, for lack of a better way to present this. But as we've already discussed, the short version is stronger enemies plus they've made more progress to your last spell equals more corpse chance. And what you can see pretty clearly is that the percentage increases on the left for 08, the boonies, as it were, are relatively small. Even if you kill a bulky in the 08 8+ tiles away from your haven, it looks like you're only getting about 20% chance to spawn a corpse. Whereas if we look over to the right at, say, the haven, that same bulky in your haven is producing something around 70%. So the short thing that you should take away from this, for lack of anything else, is that as you go to the right, aka you get closer and closer to your base, you're going to get more and more chance to spawn corpses, to the point where if you kill a bulky less than 3 tiles away from the last spell, you are guaranteed to get a corpse. The other thing that I should mention is that this graph has 3 lines for each one, because each tile tracks corpse, corpse pile, and corpse mountain chance separately. And the amount that a monster contributes to each of those is different, right? So you may get a lot of chance to spawn a corpse and less chance to spawn a corpse mountain. One thing that last chart left off are elite enemies. Elite enemies also contribute to the chance to spawn corpses, but they have some funky rules associated with them. So first off, elites are the same for chance to produce corpses, corpse piles, and corpse mountains. They don't do anything special there, but they do contribute an additional percentage just towards elite corpses. The elite carrions can only be generated by elite mobs, and an elite mob will never spawn an elite carrion in the 04 or the 08 locations. So basically, the enemy has to be within 3 tiles of your wall to have any chance. Perhaps the most salient detail is that any tier 2 or above elite will have 100% chance of spawning a corpse if you let them into your haven. And those tier 1 mobs, those tier 1 elites, have a 66% chance if they make it into your haven. So what that means, and perhaps the most important takeaway here, is all elites should make it into your haven to maximize the chance of getting those sweet, sweet scavenges on elite carrions. My general rule of thumb with the way that I handle them is I just snare them up and I deal with them at the end of the wave. It is amazing how long you can hold an elite at bay while you're working on everyone else. But with elites out of the way, we have to talk about the formula, So I put a formula here because clearly there is some incredibly complex stuff going on behind the scenes in the last spell, right? And, the answer is that it's not complicated at all. Basically, you just take the number of each enemy, the value of that enemy from the lookup, you multiply them together, and you sum that for each type of enemy that died, and you're going to come out with 4 percentages. Those 4 percentages will be the chance for a corpse, pile, mountain, or elite carrion to spawn, and then those 4 percentages will get rolled at the end of each night. So the way to think about it is the last spell essentially takes the whole map. They randomly start picking tiles that had enemies land on them, and then rolls a dice to see if that particular tile gets a particular corpse type spawned on it. So to visually illustrate that, I created a spreadsheet to make it easier for me to understand exactly the way that it was working. And the way that the spreadsheet works is basically everything you need is on this one page. And you go through and you fill out the stuff on the left, and then the stuff on the right tells you what you need to know. So the upper left is your location data, right? So what tile are we talking about? What map is it on? What night is it? And what location, aka is it 4 to 7 tiles from the wall? Is it in C3, which is 3 tiles from the last spell, so on and so forth. Then you put down the list of monsters that died. In this particular example, it looks like we had 2 hunters, 1 boomer, 1 winged, and 2 armored. The output that you get on the right side is a couple of things. The upper right is what you're really interested in, right? So it is your corpse types thresholds at the top, right? So you have corpses, which requires 12%. We haven't talked about thresholds, but the short version of thresholds is that if you do not exceed the threshold for a given corpse type, you don't get to roll the dice. So if you have a 5% chance of getting a mountain, you will never get a mountain, because in this particular case, you have to have a 48% chance to even get to roll for a mountain. But I digress. So the big numbers that are colored are the actual dice rolls that the game will do. So with this combination of enemies all dying on the same tile in region 04, you will have a 68% chance for a regular corpse to spawn and a 51% chance for a pile to spawn. And the game will always go from right to left, meaning it will always try to spawn the best corpse pile first. Failing that roll, it will proceed to the next one. Below that, you have the limits, and the limits are derived by what night and what map you are on. So it turns out that for Glenwall Night 1, you can get 8 corpses, 3 piles, 1 mountain, and 3 elite corpses. The elite corpses is always 3. It's always just locked in. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you have all of the summations that happen, right? So as we discussed before, you take the number of monsters, the location, you multiply it by the quantity, and that gives you the value. And then you sum up all of the values in that column, and you get the result there. This spreadsheet will be linked in the video description. So if you're interested in playing with this yourself and seeing the numbers, you are more than welcome to. So before we move on, a brief demo of what we have going on here. So let's say that we are in Lakeburg on night 4, and let's start out at 4 to 7, right? So we're playing kind of our standard conservative game. And let's say, despite the difficulty of it, we managed to take out 3 archers on the same tile and 1 accursed. So right off the bat, you'll notice that we have a 64% chance of getting ourselves a corpse and a 48% chance of getting a corpse pile, right? But this is a lot of enemies to kill in one particular location. The thing that I think is really telling is if I am just able to switch this over to In Haven, now you start to see the difference. Now we've killed 5 enemies on the same tile, and we have basically a 100% chance of getting one of the 3 mountains that we are allotted for Lakeburg Night 4. Then, if we go ahead and add, let's say, an Elite Ripper to the equation, we instantly see that we have a 100% chance of an Elite Carrion, which we could downgrade by making it a level 1, as I described before. This Elite Claw would only give us a 66% chance. But very quickly, you can see that you can kind of play around with it and see how the percent chances vary depending, right? So if we were to say get rid of the crawler that was here, so we have no more elite, if these guys almost make it inside, right? So now they are in 2 to 3 from the wall, or let's say they're even just 1 out from the wall, right? We're starting to get a decent chance of getting a mountain, but we're still killing 4 enemies on the same tile, which is not always something that you can guarantee. So anyway, so I thought this was useful because I think it gives a good perspective. You know, like for instance, if we went to Elderlicht and went to night number, let's say night number 11, right? Now we can see that if we're fighting in the Haven, even just this small number of enemies, right? And I mean, we could even get rid of the accursed and just change them to a runner, right? Even if we get 1 hunter and 2 archers, I guess I probably shouldn't have picked hunters and archers, since, you know, they're unpleasant to have inside of your base. But if we just got a splitter, a winged, and a runner, or 3 splitters, a winger, and a runner to die all on the same tile, we're still 84% chance of getting those mountains, and we can have up to 4 of them. And chances are, you know, we're going to be generating a lot of resources thanks to our decision to let enemies kind of come in. So anyways, if you want to play with that, link in the video description, but we are going to get back to the strategy kind of in depth. And the first piece of strategy that I wanted to talk about is why the Haven? Why is that the place that we are fighting? And there's kind of 2 reasons that I think the Haven is the ideal place to be fighting. And the first has everything to do with this sweet potential field diagram that I drew in the lower right here. And that is meant to explain the fact that naturally enemies funnel themselves towards the center. So when you start out, the enemies are far away and they are spread to the wind. They are very low density because they are entering through a much larger surface area than the surface area that they eventually are trying to get to, which is only 3 wide. So what that means is that they start out at low density, and then their density increases and increases until they reach C3 if you let them. And at that point, they're at like clown car levels of density, right? They're starting to form a black hole because you have, say, 200 enemies in what amounts to 12 squares. As a result, you don't want to be fighting there. 12 squares is not enough to do the work that you need to do. You'd have a serious queue of enemies standing around waiting, and it would not be a good look. The second piece of why the Haven is the perfect place is that, as you can see from the graph on the right, the other places you could fight are in relatively low supply, with the exception of like 04 and 08, which we already have established generate basically no corpses, right? They are bad places to fight because you're not going to get a lot of corpses because their values are very low. And then you have the Haven, which kind of is this perfect best of both worlds type of thing. You have a lot of room potentially for activities, and it's close enough to the last spell that you have those high value chances. You're getting nearly 100% elite corpses on everything but tier 1s. So the Haven just provides you the best of both worlds. And as for that flyer, that winged enemy, don't worry about them. They're just causing problems, as they always tend to. So now I wanted to talk a bit about economies, because I think that ultimately this is a video about economies. And what I have come to realize about economies is that there are 3 ways to play the last spell from my perspective. At this point, having played a lot of the last spell, there is a gear production approach. This is, I think, probably the one that has the highest like big numbers. It's the one where I'm like, look, I have 3,000 gold to spend. There is a resource production, which is like a little more front balanced, right? It's gold mines, it's scavenger camps, and it's like you're trying to get your economy up and going quickly, and you don't want to wait around for those 500 gold upgrades so that you can get the highest tier of gear. And then there is this third economy that is built around corpse piles. And this was one that I was sleeping on for a long time, but it is definitely a first-class entity in the canon of last spell economies. The thing that all economies have in common in the last spell is that their limiting factor is workers. This gentleman here is indeed important. You will never have more than 12 workers, although with the lone scavenger omen, you can get up to 13 for the purposes of corpse piles, which is surprisingly impactful sometimes. But the interesting thing is that all of these strategies can be mixed and matched to a certain extent. And I think that in particular, corpse piles plays a great role in filling some gaps in both gear and resource production strategies. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we kind of press forward. So the first of these, and from my perspective, the one that I think is most beneficial, is the hybrid of geared production and corpses. Gear production is very, very slow, right? You need to spend a huge amount of gold building a bunch of production buildings, getting them fully upgraded, etc. Corpse production doesn't require any of that spin up, which means that it can be a great early game accelerant. So from my perspective, the synergies here are that corpses can provide you a ton of resources to get those expensive upgrades. They can also fill in that resource gap early on and also give you an early influx of gear. Those corpse mountains, if you salvage them for gear, can get you 3 items so that you can free up a lot of money to spend on upgrades. The corpses require no investment, which means you can spend that investment elsewhere. And then there's a nice smooth transition between the two. The big challenges of combining these two is that in the long time, it doesn't work out great because production builds require a lot of real estate. And that means building a lot of production buildings inside of the haven where you want to be killing enemies. So as your footprint grows, you're going to find your ability to get corpses dwindling. And also, if you build that ring of ballistas, they're going to be doing less and less because most of the area that they cover is going to be covered by buildings. The other hybrid economic strategy that I think is worth talking about is the resource production plus corpses. And I think, to me, this is the one that I have found myself leaning to most. And the reason is that production buildings, resource production buildings, aka scavenger camps and gold mines, are relatively small. So you can fit all of your houses plus your gold mines and your scavenger camps all really, really close, leaving a fair amount of haven surrounding them for the ballistas to do their work. When you have low corpse nights, like sometimes you're just going to have a night where you're getting attacked from 3 sides and they're all very small waves and you're not going to get a ton of corpse piles. It's nice to be able to sink those workers into a gold mine or into a scavenger camp to just get some resources, not quite the amount you would get from corpses, but still a fair amount. It also means that after you, say, salvage all of your big corpse mountains, you can sink the rest of your workers into a gold mine to get more gold, to get a influx for recruiting a high-level hero from the inn or something like that. And then corpses carry into the late game as you start to get, 4 or 5 mountains. You can just ignore them and they will still be producing, but you don't have to spend any workers on them. Late game, the only real downside is that you've probably spent some money on upgrades on gold mines to, say, be able to put 2 workers and reduce the cost of in workers for them. So you're not getting as much out of those upgrades, but that's a relatively minor one. And then last but not least, and the reason that I am making this video is, what about just going corpses? And the short answer is that the things that I like most about the corpse strategy is, first, the return on investment. You are getting so much for investing so little when it comes to corpses. You don't have to do any upgrades to make them better. The mountains, gold, and material yields are off the charts. 3 items for 2 workers is fantastic. And you're getting level 5 gear from those even if you don't upgrade anything. Right? If I want to get the same thing from my armorer, I'm spending 700 gold for it. Secondly, in terms of actual investment, right, the thing that you are getting the return on, 12 workers is easy to get. It's rare that I finish a game without 12 workers, and the total cost of the 40 gold upgrade and the 70 gold upgrade are relatively minor. So that's not a huge deal. The other big piece of the equation is just the savings, right? There's the opportunity cost of not having to build a seer, not losing 3 workers to push back the fog. You also don't have a lot of building upgrades to do. So just overall, you're not spending a lot to enable this strategy. And then last but not least, and this is just something that I do that's kind of cheeky, but if you want to save up a little bit, you can also keep your base very tight by destroying your shop and then rebuilding it when you have a pile of gear to sell, or building an inn only when you want to recruit heroes and then getting rid of it after. If you've watched any of my recent runs, you've probably seen me do that. But overall, that's the strat in a nutshell. I think very genuinely that I was sleeping a bit on the overall value of corpse piles. I always liked them, but I think that when you start to build your game around them and deliberately pursue them, there is a huge value to get out of corpse piles. So I think I've said what I had to say. If this video was interesting, or you learned something, or you want to see more videos like it, now is the time to hit that like button and let me know and leave me a comment. Did I get something wrong? Did you learn something interesting? Please, please let me know. But other than that, I'm planning to start making some more guides in this vein and in this format. So if you like the kind of high-level strategy overview followed by a bit more of a deep dive, please also let me know that. And if you're interested in seeing those guides when they come out, please hit that subscribe button. But for now, that's been it. I hope that I have helped you to master corpse piles and change the game for you. Also, let me know if this was clickbait. I aspired for it not to be. But that's it for me. Have a good one, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.